March 15th, 1493. The hero returns. Having departed Spain as little more than an eccentric merchant, Christopher Columbus is swept up in a flurry of fame and legend. The man who sailed across an impossible Atlantic to stave a swift, safe trade route to Asia. But contrary to his claims, Columbus hadn't led his tiny fleet to Asia. His discovery was North America. He and his crew of sailors had been the first Europeans to set foot on the continent since the time of the Vikings. 39 of his men had been left to further explore the mysteries of the Isle of Hispaniola, whilst Columbus prepared to set sail westwards, finally reuniting with them once again. Only on this journey, his mission wasn't discovery and trade, but to convert and colonize. Columbus was about to spark a firestorm of Spanish brutality across the Caribbean, opening up the new world to a mass of European explorers, bringing with them disease, death, and subjugation, and marking the dawn of the age of the Conquistadores.
Columbus certainly was a great self-promoter. The first exploration, the first voyage is, as we know, involves 3 very small ships. He returns to Spain. He tells the Catholic monarchs about this great land that he's discovered that's ripe for colonization, for settlement, for Christianization. In sort of telling that account, what he aims to do is enlist the financial support of the monarchs and private investors for his exploits.
Columbus probably has some doubts into his mind as to whether or not he has actually found what he said he was finding. But in reality, one of the reasons why he's making that claim is that everything that he had agreed to with Isabella in 1491, before his first voyage, was predicated on him finding Asia. As he became increasingly aware that he was probably nowhere near the Asia that he sought, he still knew that he had to go back. He had to either try and find the place that he was looking for, or at least try and become so successful that it wouldn't matter.
In the case of the papal bulls that the Catholic kings received in the aftermath of Columbus arriving to the Americas, those papal bulls grant the kings authority to spread through the Americas while converting the native population. And that's kind of the stipulation, that their most important charge is going to be evangelization of the people that they encounter.
After the first voyage, once it's become clear that it is possible to cross to these islands, how you do it, how you get back, that there's potentially sources of wealth and maybe places where you can create settlements. The second voyage is really the beginning of a Spanish attempt to create settlements in the Caribbean. It's no longer just exploratory. This is the beginning of a sustained campaign of settlement and invasion.
Ever since he was a young boy helping his father weave wool in their family's humble workshop, Columbus had dreamt of immense wealth and a gleaming reputation as an unrivaled seafarer. Finally, his fantasy was within reach. The Crown's promise to invest an immensely healthy sum in a second voyage attracted a huge interest from fellow explorers, allowing him to commandeer a far greater fleet.
The second expedition was a large operation with hundreds of individuals, goods, everything you can imagine to create a functioning Spanish society in the Americas.
Having made it and come back, there are a lot more individuals that are willing to sign on to the expedition. People that were dubious of his earlier claims for not really knowing the size of the world are willing to join this expedition.
You have farmers, you had people from the trades, skilled labor, but you also had clergymen and you had some nobles. So it was kind of like a good slice of Castilian society represented in this expedition.
He comes with, we believe to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 ships. These ships are loaded with the essentials of European life. They come with wheat and barley to be planted in what they think about as sort of large fields. They come with cattle, pigs and horses, as well as sheep and goats.
September 1493. A current of excitement flowed through the bustling port of Cadiz. Columbus was now a major celebrity, the public firmly rooting for his success. This was the man who had brought them closer than ever to Asia, with all its exotic goods. Painfully aware of having thoroughly breached his contract, Columbus grinned along to the applause. If anything went wrong, this trip would bankrupt him. The ships were loaded with vital supplies to feed the 1,000 voyagers joining Columbus on his epic quest across the sea. And as the morning sun rose on September 24th, this mighty flotilla set off, speeding along a swift southerly route. Sightings of the Lesser Antilles were first made on November 3rd. Veering north, within 3 weeks, Hispaniola appeared on the horizon. It was here, only 9 months earlier, that Columbus had left 39 of his most trusted men in charge of a newly constructed fortress.
In 1493, when Columbus's second voyage arrived at the site of the original fort that Columbus and his crew had left behind on the first voyage, they discovered the place had been razed, had been burned.
Columbus discovers that the contingent of men that he had left at the site of La Navidad has been killed. And in fact, the cacique nearby, Guancanagati, is in hiding for fear of reprisals from Columbus for the death of his men. Eventually, Columbus is able to sort of lure Guancanagati out and sort of deduce that some of his men had been excessive in their demands of the local community.
It seems possible that actually Spaniards harassed quite a lot of indigenous people for food. It's possible that they harassed women also. It seems that, you know, indigenous people might have resented like the abuse that they received by these Spaniards who were stranded and might have acted against them. This started a chain of conflicts with indigenous polities.
Columbus then decides to move the settlement a little bit more to the east and establishes a new community of La Isabela, named after the Queen of Castile. The problem is that there are a lot more Spaniards. They don't have enough European food stores. They haven't brought enough food to sort of readily feed everyone for a long time. And so they begin to place a lot of demands on the local indigenous groups that they have created some ties to for food. He's bringing a lot more mouths to feed, but also a lot more people that want to be able to profit from the voyage. And as a result, Columbus begins this march inland with as many men as he can muster to try and find both the source of the gold that he's been told is there, as well as through force or through alliance, get access to more indigenous communities that can help supply this fledgling colony.
Columbus was fully aware that the immediate survival of the Spaniards in these strange new lands would be solely dependent on allegiances made with the indigenous people. How else could he build and maintain the thriving colony he had promised Queen Isabella? It may not be Asia, but at least he could still make a success of Hispaniola. He would have to ensure he wasn't returned to Spain in chains.
When the Spaniards reached the Caribbean islands, those islands and the mainland all around those islands, or the circum-Caribbean, was well inhabited, and it had been inhabited for thousands of years.
The Great Antilles were populated mostly, but not exclusively, by Taínos. They spoke a common language but they were actually divided politically into different cacicazgos or chiefdoms. They had alliances and wars between each other sometimes. They traded with each other, they married each other. So it was a complex society just like any other in that sense.
And the chiefs in the Taino word, or it's a Spanish Hispanization of the Taino word, is cacique. And the Spaniards latch onto that word and they think of those individuals, those local chiefs or rulers, as being caciques. They actually carry that word onto the mainland and they assign it to indigenous chiefs all over the Americas, so it becomes an important concept. The interaction between Spaniards and indigenous peoples in the Caribbean at first is relatively peaceful. But very quickly, it dissolves into violence. Then there's this downward spiral that starts. In some ways, it starts with Columbus's first landing, but particularly with the much larger second voyage is when it begins to spiral down.
As the months dragged on, relations between the Spanish invaders and the influential caciques were rapidly deteriorating, as was the notion of peaceful cohabitation of the islands.
They were completely dependent on indigenous people for food. And indigenous people, Taínos, provided food freely and willingly as a sign of hospitality, but the Spaniards ate voraciously. There is just not enough supplies, there's not enough food to go around. It's going to become a great problem. There's going to be a great hunger among colonists. The Spaniards will organize expeditions to the indigenous towns to raid for food. You can imagine what kind of terrible things can be actually executed when you are starved and you're thinking that everybody around you is conspiring against you. At the same time, Columbus has a mission, which is to locate the source of wealth.
He wants to find a way to turn a profit. To do that, he very quickly identifies gold as the commodity that will be most valuable for export.
Gold in Hispaniola was found normally in riverbeds. So in the proximity of these sources of gold, he's going to place forts. There are going to be also forts in proximity to indigenous towns, sometimes to kind of keep an eye on them. At the same time, Columbus is not going to be afraid of using quite brutal tactics to scare the population into submission.
If anyone shows resistance, he uses an overwhelming attack, something that the Spaniards term a fuego y a sangre, war of fire and blood, in order to attack those that might resist him.
That kind of violence, it was considered to be the best way to ensure that indigenous people were not going to rebel. It was kind of like the shock, producing a shock with violence that was such that it would kind of like mute a response.
Communities that initially ally with the Spaniards very quickly feel oppressed by their demands. That the Spanish are demanding huge amounts of food, they're demanding labor at times, and as a result, there is a sort of built-in tension even with allied caciques over those demands.
August 1494. Columbus was losing control of Hispaniola, of the respect of his men, and of his own swelling ego. Gripped by fear that letters home to Queen Isabella would reveal the true nature of this mounting disaster, he struck out to nearby islands, praying he would discover something, anything of value, which could buy him some time. But upon his return to Hispaniola, a startled Columbus was shocked to learn that nearly 2/3 of the Europeans, the people whose lives he was essentially responsible for, had fatally succumbed to famine and disease. Survivors felt the bitter sting of resentment. Their friends and crewmates dead, and for what? An aggressive tyrant hell-bent on making a name for himself, whilst claiming every pebble of gold that they had found.
They saw him as a kind of like a failed leader in many ways. So opposition against Columbus is going to appear very quickly, and there are going to be factions of Spaniards who are going to even run away from the Spanish settlements and go to live with indigenous communities.
Desperation to retain control drove Columbus into survival mode. If a mutiny broke out, his career, and maybe even his life, would be over. His solution was to allow the colonists to forcibly extract labor from the native islanders. This would eventually lead to the Spanish introducing a cruel, formalized system of domination, the encomienda.
The encomienda was considered a relationship between two individuals. The encomendero, is a Spaniard, and then the encomendado, or which is like the person that is put under the protection of the Spaniards.
These indigenous peoples were entrusted to them. That's the word encomienda, means to entrust. And so the idea was that this was not tantamount to slavery, but this was in order to protect the indigenous people. So the theory was that the overlord, the encomendero, was a protector. He would see to the well-being of the indigenous peoples. He would see to their conversion to Christianity. But in return, he would be able to make some demands, whether in tribute or in labor.
A relationship that was intended to protect indigenous people and to evangelize them, it was quickly subverted into a form of forced labor.
Without labor to produce food, to mine those precious metals, or to raise livestock, the New World is meaningless. And so encomienda really was a grant of land, but the real part of the encomienda was a grant of labor. And so they abused the native people. They exploited them, they beat them, they raped them, they overworked them, they did not want to educate or Christianize them, and so the mortality rate on these encomiendas was just staggering.
Despite his grand ambitions, Columbus was a mediocre mapmaker, not a master politician. By the close of the 15th century, his dreadful decisions had cost Hispaniola its peace and prosperity, turning it into a place of death and subjugation. Its capital, the newly established city of Santo Domingo, was the dark heart of this violent regime of cruelty against the local people.
As Columbus becomes more brutal in trying to get gold, more and more caciques become resistant. And 1495, 96, 97 is really a period of quite broad conflict between caciques in the center part of the island to the south of where the Spanish have established themselves, as well as to the east, who begin to attack the Spanish. The Spanish advantage, particularly their steel swords, their crossbows, to a lesser extent their firearms, made it an incredibly mismatched fight. It's pretty clear that even a small number of Spaniards, a dozen, 20, could hold their own against hundreds of Taino warriors. Military engagements not only killed the warriors that fought the Spaniards in battle, but then precipitated things like famine, which then only hastened death due to starvation or malnutrition or eventually disease.
October 1499. Enslavement of indigenous people was by now commonplace. But news of Columbus's sordid moves to suppress and control Hispaniola's inhabitants had spread back across the ocean, reaching the turrets of Iberia and his royal patron, Isabella.
People in Spain started to question what was going on very early on. Concerns start coming simultaneously with the encomienda. things went very badly, very quickly with the encomienda. So, concerns for the treatment of the Indians. It comes right away from friars who are there, asked to do the conversion, and being confronted with conquistadors who are being violent, who are not being a good model, and writing back saying, how are we supposed to make people like Christianity, to want people to, to wanting to go to heaven if all they can find is these guys around. They think if they're going to heaven, I don't want to be there. So that sort of conflict among Spaniards is absolutely simultaneous. It's happening at the same time as the conquest. And how powerful that was, when the criticism comes from within, that's very problematic. All this sort of concern is embodied in the person of Isabel of Castile. And people went to her, partly in this gendered way, perhaps as a sort of maternal figure, but also she was the one who was the most vocal.
In Isabella's eyes, the indigenous people of the New World were subjects of the Crown of Castile, Iberians who ought to be embraced, not enslaved. Columbus was in serious trouble, and he knew it.
He's shipped back to Spain in chains to answer to Queen Isabel. He's not thrown permanently in prison, he's released, but his contract is considered to be null and void, and so he's stripped of the titles that he was able to claim in his contract, that he's essentially the ruler for Spain of these islands.
Columbus had left chaos in his wake, but Queen Isabella believed that continued intervention would restore and maintain order across the new lands he had mistakenly discovered in her name. The crown appointed Francisco de Bobadilla, the man who had arrested Columbus on Isabella's orders, as the second governor of the Indies in August 1500. Following his death during a hurricane in July 1502, formidable nobleman Nicolas de Ovando took the helm.
Nicolas de Ovando arrived in Hispaniola with a great number of ships and individuals. It's kind of like the big second wave, let's say, of colonists arriving to Hispaniola. And also he's going to be extraordinarily aggressive in his battle against the remaining indigenous polities that still existed in Hispaniola. He's going to be very successful in that, but also very, very brutal in the way they can actually achieve his goals. The governorship of Nicolas de Ovando is seen as the moment in which the Spanish grip over the land was really solidified.
The Crown clearly trusted in the Caribbean's potential. Why else would they continue to invest in its development? Popular tales of its gold and glory had begun to spread. A great number of settlers began to make the perilous journey across the Atlantic.
There were all kinds of ideas about the riches that existed in the New World, the sense of adventure, the sense of possibility.
In the popular imagination, everybody who moved there would be able to discover a great empire and strike it rich very quickly.
These are people from very difficult backgrounds, poverty-stricken, very few opportunities. They used to talk about hacer las Américas, to make oneself in the Americas, most of them with the intention of then returning home and living life as lords with the booty that they had accumulated there.
Within 3 decades of Columbus stumbling across Hispaniola and establishing his fragile colony, thousands were leaving Europe each and every year, placing their faith in the New World and the promise of its riches. They came from a wide range of backgrounds, but would become known by one collective title: Conquistadors.
So the conquistadors are actually quite a diverse bunch of people. We think of them as Spanish. It's called the Spanish Conquest. Most of them were Spanish, but not all of them were. There were other Europeans.
By and large, conquistadors were young men, though there are some women, who were looking to improve their status in Spanish society, whether by creating a noble name for themselves or, more typically, serving the crown and receiving sort of lifelong benefits as members of Spanish society.
But making this fresh start required a traumatic journey over thousands of miles of sea. Discomfort and danger were among the few guarantees on offer during this agonizing transatlantic passage.
16th century ships were rather small, shockingly small, say 100, 120 square meters. And in this space, if you can imagine that you had anywhere from 100 to 120 people living day and night with basically no bathroom. The passage between Spain and the Caribbean islands in the early 16th century would take anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks.
It depended on the winds. It depended on the seaworthiness of the ship. It depended upon the capability of the people navigating the ship. They ran out of food. They ran out of water. Sailors became sick with scurvy and other kinds of illnesses. They became dissatisfied. Sometimes mutinies occurred. There were all kinds of stories out there about what awaited them. Some were very fearful that they would encounter these half-human, half-beast individuals. There were illustrations throughout Europe that showed human beings with their faces and their mouths in their stomachs. There were stories of, 10, 12-foot giants that wandered the land.
If you're lucky, you only make one of these expeditions, only make one voyage, and you happen to be part of an expedition that discovers, let's say, the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, whatever it is, you make enough that if you can then make it back home, you're set for the rest of your life.
If you had the desire, the nerve, or the necessity, you could jump on a ship and be part of this. No training, but you knew also that the chances of survival were pretty slim. But if you did manage to survive, who knows what kind of wealth and what kind of stature you could achieve in the process.
In many cases, they were private expeditions. And so basically, the leader of this expedition or captain would also invest his own capital into leasing or buying ships. Individual conquistadors would bring their own weapons and their own provisions, and so they would be entitled to additional shares of whatever proceeds they would find, and they would just simply recruit in Seville.
The financial and physical risks of the New World may have been shouldered by the conquistadors, but permission to be there was granted by the Crown. This was sealed in the form of a detailed contract.
Some of these contracts were for trading with the natives only, others were to establish forts or cities, etc. So there were different possibilities.
The Crown, because it gave permission, said it was entitled to a certain percentage of the wealth that was uncovered as a result of the expedition. This begins to breed some resentment on the part of those who took all the risks, and it's the Crown that's becoming wealthy off of all of their efforts.
As scores of Spaniards arrived on the sands of the Caribbean, alongside them came an unpredictable and disturbing peril: disease.
Now, the explanation that we all learned while we were in grade school was about the biological effects that the Europeans brought illnesses for which the natives did not have defenses for or immunity for, so virgin soil epidemics. But there was more than that.
If we combined war plus exhaustive conditions, working conditions, and we are also disease, indigenous mortality was catastrophic. The population of Hispaniola before the arrival of the Spaniards could be considered around let's say 500,000 individuals. And by 1518, there are about 3,000 natives left. So in the process of settling and colonizing Hispaniola, Spaniards depopulated the Caribbean basin And not only a loss of life, but a loss of culture, a loss of family life, structure. We're talking about a horrifying event. As the indigenous population in Hispaniola declined, Spaniards saw themselves looking for labor elsewhere. It meant bringing forced labor from other islands of the Caribbean. In the first 30 years of the 16th century, Spaniards conducted multiple raids to secure indigenous labor and to bring them as slaves to Hispaniola to work in the gold fields.
So the conquest of Cuba, the conquest of Puerto Rico, conquests to the north in places like the Bahamas are really intended not so much to gain access to new areas of land, but really to capture people that can be put to work on Hispaniola to continue to extract gold from the island.
So Spaniards are going to propel themselves throughout the Greater Antilles, populating every island and trying to control the indigenous population, which was going to be an ongoing process. And they meant a significant loss of life for everybody involved.
And as those sources of labor themselves become scarce or become harder to access, the Spanish begin to turn to trade with the Portuguese, and enslaved Africans quickly come in and are used both in domestic service in cities like Santo Domingo, in rural service working as ranchers and cowboys to maintain livestock supplies, as well as to work in the mines and eventually to work on sugar plantations, which begin to be established in the first couple decades of the 16th century.
When the gold in Hispaniola starts declining, there's going to be a very conscious move towards sugar as the next most important commodity that the island can produce. So Hispaniola is really the first sugar plantation in the Americas.
We know that in many places like Santo Domingo, the population of enslaved Africans came to meet, or in some cases exceed, the number of Spaniards.
However, back in Europe, the Crown faced a growing opposition to the brutality of its state-sponsored privateers. Amongst the most famous of the early objectors was Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, a man who had already formed his own complicated relationship with the Indies.
Bartolomé de las Casas came out to the New World as a young man. He settled on the island of Hispaniola. He participated in the invasion of Cuba, and as a result of his participation in the invasion of Cuba, was made an encomendero, that is, he was given a grant of Indians who would pay tribute to him.
In 1511, he heard Antonio de Montesinos preaching a sermon against the abuses of the indigenous peoples who were living in these kind of encomenderos, the cruelty, the kind of dehumanization.
Bartolomé de las Casas then goes through a spiritual transformation. He renounces his encomienda, and he then decides to join the Dominican order. Montesinos had been a Dominican.
And then he became a lifelong advocate for indigenous rights. He's called the Apostle of the Indies. He becomes known as the Apostle of the Indies.
He was one of the first ones to denounce the quick disappearance of indigenous people and try to actually exert some action from the Crown. He tried to advocate for some legislation to protect indigenous people.
His idea was that it was essential to remove natives from the grasp of conquistadors because that would only lead to their complete extinction.
He is a very, very important figure. Even at the time, you will read correspondence which talks about that Dominican or the Bishop of Chiapas and his troublemaking. So his message was loud and clear, and it was heard in the highest halls of government.
The crown was shocked by this, saying this is not what the church and what God has set us out to do. So in 1512, Spain enacts the laws of Burgos, which begins to delineate how Spaniards will treat native people.
The problem, of course, is that from theory to practice, there is a long distance. So even though at certain point, indigenous slavery is going to be prohibited, there is always going to be an asterisk to the law. There is always going to be ways in which Spaniards can, if not disobey the law, definitely walk around it.
One such loophole was officially written into existence as Spanish law, only a year after the creation of the laws of Burgos.
A jurist in Spain named Justo Palacios created a document that was called the requerimiento. That means the requirement. Palacios laid out a religious and legal rationale for the enslavement and total domination of people of the Americas. If the people accept, then they will be treated well, says the document. If they do not accept, they will be enslaved, and their children and wives will be taken away, they will be killed. This document made possible things that would not otherwise have been imaginable. Then, from the Spanish point of view, all of these actions were legitimate.
It's a loophole that's absolutely massive. It's a loophole that you can just sail an entire conquest expedition right through. And that's what the Spaniards do. So the Caribbean very quickly becomes a colonial disaster.
But violence was not the Spaniards' only import to the New World. Their arrival in the Caribbean began a complex biological exchange, which would leave a lasting impact on the Western Hemisphere.
The Caribbean is a laboratory of empire for Spain. It is at this time that you find many of the elements that you're going to find later in colonial culture in other places of the world. They happen first here. They're going to try at least to introduce agricultural products into the Caribbean with little success. Things like wheat, things like grapes to make wine, things like cattle, like horses, pigs, dogs as well.
They also carry the first diseases from the old world, particularly what we think about now as swine flu. Within a decade, all the settlements had fallen. The animals had either died, been eaten, or had run off into the frontier, and diseases had begun to spread, particularly swine flu, amongst native populations. So it's an abject failure, the first settlements that Columbus launched. But more broadly, the whole colonial enterprise in the Caribbean itself is very much similarly a failure through the early period until the mainland becomes the focus.
We know that relatively early on, there were many instances of rape perpetrated by Spaniards on indigenous women. But as you moved into the early 16th century, there were some cases where you see more intentional relationships between Spaniards and indigenous women that then lead to children that are more part of the Spanish world than part of indigenous communities. Eventually, by the 1520s, the Spanish have coined a new word to describe the children born between Spaniards and typically indigenous women, and these children are called mestizos, which has the same root as the word mixture, right? So these are mixed people.
Having passed away shortly after Columbus's return, Queen Isabella's power had been inherited by an unsympathetic King Ferdinand. He continued to reject increasingly desperate requests from the disgraced explorer for the reinstatement of his privileges. Time had run out for Christopher Columbus. He died in obscurity on the 20th of May, 1506, at only 55 years old.
Columbus was obviously important because he was so tremendously wrong about what he sought to do. He, of course, is a very controversial figure. He was controversial during his lifetime. We have to recognize that due to his efforts, the Spaniards did create a colony. They did create a permanent presence in the New World. And that permanent presence then acted as the jumping off place for further expeditions.
In the second voyage, he learned to master the winds and currents of the Atlantic, which are fundamental to be able to cross the ocean in the age of sail. It's the voyage that established the permanent navigational route between Europe and the Iberian Peninsula and the Americas for the next 3 centuries, basically.
He extensively explored the Caribbean, but he also continued to believe that he had found a passageway to the east. He never admitted that he had come across lands that had not been seen or encountered by Europeans before.
By 1498, everyone believed that they were in a new world. People are drafting a new cartography of the globe that includes these islands that were not a part of India. Most likely, few of the settlers or conquistadors thought they were actually in India either.
The Spanish mission to peacefully Christianize the Caribbean may have been a failure. But the establishment of colonies on Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti, Jamaica, and Cuba would land the conquistadors with an incredible opportunity.
The Caribbean was a proving ground wherein the Spaniards were able to identify and practice strategies of conquest that then would propel them to the mainland, where they would be able to use those conquests against new peoples in the search for more tribute, more labor, more income, ultimately more lands for their monarch.
Things like the encomienda is practiced and experimented with in the Caribbean. Plantations are established in the Caribbean. And settlements with sort of a Spanish center and indigenous periphery are experimented with in the Caribbean.
You had to have a point of focus with sufficient individuals there in order to begin the other discoveries. We have enough people on the islands, we have enough resources to begin to build ships on the island, and so expeditions no longer have to make the 3,000-mile trip all the way from Spain in order to discover new areas. And this dramatically changes the nature of the discoveries. Without a base of operations such as Hispaniola, such as the city of Santo Domingo, the rest of it just would not have happened.
One such expedition in 1513 would see the conquistadors make a pivotal discovery, offering them their first substantial taste of mainland America. The conquistadors were coming for Panama.
Panama was the first major mainland conquest after the Caribbean. The campaign led by Pedro Arias Dávila was arguably one of the most brutal campaigns of conquest in all of the Americas. Between those years, it's possible that the Spanish decimated as many as 250,000 Cueva peoples in Panama. From Panama, the Spanish are able to establish a new foothold that they quickly realize offers access to another ocean, a monumental discovery for the future course of the conquest of the Americas.
As the second decade of the 16th century draws to a close, one high-ranking politician stuck in an administrative position in Cuba grows anxious for adventure. Hernán Cortés soon sets his sights on the mainland, intoxicated by stories of a legendary city of gold. What lay ahead of him would prove to be one of the greatest and deadliest Spanish conquests, the vast city of Tenochtitlan and the extraordinary empire of the Aztecs.